Hi, I'm Allie Jackson Jolly. I'm here with Valerie Wilson. She is the director of the program on race, ethnicity, and the economy for the Economic Policy Institute. Valerie, welcome, and thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for having me, Allie.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in getting to the bottom of what I've heard called the confidence recession. And that is the situation in which economic indicators say that the economy is good, and yet many Americans are skeptical. They are a little concerned. They don't feel that the economy is good. And so I was hoping to start with, you could explain what might be going on here.
So I think the first problem with trying to understand what this so-called expectation recession or whatever is that we assume that both things can't be true at the same time. That it can't both be true that our economic indicators suggest that we have a strong economy, and that people still feel some insecurities with respect to how they are personally experiencing the economy. And I think that disconnect comes down to a matter of expectations and our point of reference in evaluating what the true state of the economy is. The indicators are clear. We've had unemployment below 4% for the last over 2 years, which is exceptionally low unemployment in the longer term history of this country. We had rising inflation in recent years, but we've started to see that come down as well. But when people are experiencing inflation in this current time, we also have to consider that we had nearly a decade of inflation that was just about 2%. So when you're looking at 10 years of about 2%, we get a spike up to 8% in 2022. Now it's more like 3%. This is like an annual average. Then relative to what it used to be, that definitely feels tighter, even though unemployment is really low, even though GDP has been relatively stable over the last year and a half, at least since the pandemic as well. I think another concern, in addition to inflation for households and related to inflation, has to do with the cost of things that are just basic to our existence. Shelter is one of the components of the inflation indicators that is still pretty elevated, the cost of housing, whether that's renting or buying, and food prices have been elevated for some time. So those everyday experiences really stand in contrast to what the indicators tell us as it relates to what people are experiencing. I also think as it relates to expectations, people feel like if we're in a strong economy, then their experience ought to be a certain thing. They shouldn't feel stressed. They shouldn't feel, like things are tight. And they do. So I think those are some of the tensions that we're dealing with when we look at what people say about the economy versus what the numbers are telling us.
Yeah, and so when, some of the things I've heard, it compared to when you go to a doctor and you say, I'm really not feeling well. The doctor says, no, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. And you're not feeling well. So when you say that both things can be true, the economy can be doing well and large swaths of the population can also feel like they're still struggling. Does that suggest that there's a new way that we should be talking about the economy when we say the economy is doing well? Should there be another way that we're gauging that so that we're, politicians, policymakers can be more in touch with the actual experience of the American people?
Yeah, I think it's always important to contextualize what it is we're talking about. When we say the economy is doing well, I think more than anything, we're saying we're not in an economic crisis. We averted a much more severe economic crisis coming out of the pandemic. We're currently, have been experiencing a pretty robust economic recovery. We don't see any immediate signs of a recession. So that says there's not a crisis. But that doesn't mean that people aren't experiencing challenges. And again, that has a lot to do with our point of reference. When we think about what we've seen in terms of wage growth over the last 40 years or so, even if now we're seeing that, wages are growing, for the last 40 plus years, they've been pretty flat. So yeah, I mean, they're growing now, they're starting to catch up, but they're having to catch up with 40 years of no growth. And so I think that affects how people are currently feeling when they look at the broader macro indicators and think about what that actually means in terms of their own standard of living.
Yeah, so as we head into, 2024 is a big election year, obviously. What we've been seeing some of is that those that are holding public office currently, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on, are touting this growing economy under their tenure, and those who may be looking to gain office are sort of pointing more to I guess that I'll call it the real feel of what it feels like to be living in this economy for many, middle class Americans. Um, what do you think, like as an economist in your role, what can you expect? What should we expect our elected officials to be talking about, in terms of reassuring that there's no recession, excuse me, that the economy is actually growing, and stay people's fears about the confidence.
Well, I think politics is politics, and and people running for office are going to use the message they think will be most effective at winning them an election. In terms of what they should be saying to people, I think it is important to really balance those two things, to talk about the positive things and the fact that there is no national economic crisis. At the same time, that they can acknowledge and recognize communities that are suffering and have had a hard time, but more than just that, propose ways that they're going to address that hardship. I think those are much more important messages that people want to hear, more so than just the sort of back and forth, I'm better, no, I'm better. Acknowledge what the situation is, give people the truth about where we are, acknowledge the areas where there's still opportunities for growth and improvement, and offer real solutions to those things.
Yeah, and we're almost out of time, but you've recently spoken about this economy that we're in right now for communities that have historically been invisible or more marginalized. Specifically, you've talked about this being a good economy for the Black community. Could you speak a little bit to what you mean by that?
Yeah, that's another one that it's always important to put it into proper context. Relatively good compared to historically where we've been, but historically hasn't been great. That being the case, we do have record low Black unemployment rate. The last year and a half, the Black unemployment rate has been under 6%, which is unheard of in the longer historical record. But I think if we sort of just take that under 6% alone, we were to say our overall unemployment rate was under 6% for a year, people may not be so thrilled or excited or think that's such a good thing. But again, when we're looking at relative to history and what's been, when we think about the disparities between Black and white workers, which is typically about a 2-to-1 gap, that also is a place where we can acknowledge that there's been some progress in terms of absolute measures historically, but there's still room for improvement there as well. But again, I think people would much rather have a 5.76% unemployment than a 10%.
Yeah, and final question before we leave, we've been talking about the doom and gloom of this economy. So I'm going to ask you to send us out on a high note. What makes you optimistic when you look into 2024 and beyond in terms of what could happen with the economy?
That's okay. That's an interesting note because again, the numbers suggest there's nothing on the horizon indicating that we're going to go into a recession. GDP growth is strong, inflation's coming down, unemployment has been at a sustained under 4% for 2.5 years, or going on 2.5 years.
Okay,
So
but I wouldn't be a good journalist because I heard the other side of that.
yeah,
So give me the other side so we're not painting it just the way, just an optimism.
so my anxiety is not just is not based on what I see in terms of the economy, the metrics of the economy. My anxiety is more about what's happening politically in the country and whether or not we continue to make good decisions for the economy. So there's nothing now that suggests anything should go wrong, but we know that poor policy decisions have a significant impact on our economy.
Oh, and
this
so what specifically, tell me, like, what are those poor policy decisions, if you could name them, that worry you the most?
I worry about extreme decisions or decisions that aren't necessarily based on the facts and the real economic situation, but are more just sort of political pandering. A lot of that has to do with an unwillingness to make the kinds of fiscal investments that we need to make to continue to have a strong and thriving economy. So it has a lot to do with whether or not we're going to continue to make all the investments in infrastructure and clean energy moving forward that I think, depending on who is elected, those decisions could be quite different on those things.
So your recommendation is that we should be looking for political representation that will make hard decisions for the long term. And those are in the things that we think will grow this country. Is that correct? Am I
That will make
understanding that?
that will make smart decisions for the long term. I don't think they're that hard. It's just about making the smart decisions.
All right. Well, now we are out of time. I really appreciate having you here. Thank you for making us smarter about this really complex topic. And I hope to have you back and keep this conversation going.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.